Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm just seeing if we have some participants logging in now. We're currently starting from about 10 participants. That's going up. So it's very good to have everyone here with us today. Welcome to our EALTA webinar. Okay, we'll just wait for maybe 1 more minute for people to log on, and then we'll get started. As you come online and you log on, yes, if you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat function, please feel free to do that. Just say who you are and where you're joining us from. Okay, so let's start, I think. So good afternoon again, everyone, and welcome to our EALTA webinar. Thanks for joining us today. This EALTA series is a series of 3 webinars, and we try to have 3 or 4 of them a year on topics which are of interest to our community, the language assessment community. And topics so far have been based on the interests of our EALTA members. So we've done things on statistics, different skills, integrated skills in language assessment, standards, and the common European framework of reference. So today's topic is going to be a little bit different. Today we're looking at issues in testing sign language. Okay. I'll introduce myself first. My name is Richard Spivey, and I'm the EALTA webinar coordinator. I'm a test development researcher at the British Council in London, in the UK. So today, as I said, it's going to be a little bit different. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Helsa Borenstein from Overseas Interpreting, and she will be providing sign language interpretation during the session today, as you can see already. So the webinar today will be about 40 minutes long, plus we'll have about 15 to 20 minutes of questions. And you can use the question and answer function, please, to ask any questions that you have. But we'll keep all the answers to the questions at the end of Tobias's talk today. So you can also experiment with the view of your screen. You can use the view options at the top of the page, and you can have all the speakers, probably best to have all the speakers down the side, and then you can see all of us. And you can pull the margin at the side to make the speakers' videos larger or smaller. You can use the chat function to introduce yourself, as I said, and apologies in advance for any technical issues. Everything looks okay at the moment, but you never know what will happen. Okay, so let's get round to our speaker today. A long-time EALTA member, Tobias Haug. And the subject of his talk is the methodological challenges developing tests of sign language proficiency. Now, Tobias is currently the director of sign language interpreter training at the University of Applied Sciences of Special Needs Education in Zurich, in Switzerland. He's a leading figure in sign language research in Europe, and he's especially interested in sign language development and assessment for different language groups across Europe, especially with regard to web-based language testing and signed language interpreting. Tobias is the author of quite an impressive number of publications. That's papers, books, book chapters, and he's a very active and highly respected conference presenter. He's currently involved in different Swiss, European, and other international projects. He's the founder of the company Sign Language Assessment Services, and of course he's an active member of EALTA and coordinator of the EALTA Special Interest Group for Signed Language Assessment. So he is a very busy man, as you can see. So I think I'll hand over to Tobias now. Thank you for joining us again today. And
so thanks, Richard, for the very kind introduction. I feel very honored to be asked by the EALTA for doing this webinar today. Based on the registration, I saw that we have a very diverse audience. So I've tried to cover all kinds of backgrounds in this presentation, but as you can imagine, not everything will be possible. So, okay, I'll be talking about, particularly on the context of the German-speaking part of Switzerland, and where the learning and assessment takes place. I will briefly talk about a state of research in sign language assessment, or generally speaking about sign language research in more general terms, about the description of sign languages, about language resources that are available or not available, about methodological issues that that are linked to research. And I'll try to, based on concrete projects, I will try to address different issues, both in terms of challenges for developing tests, for doing research in sign language testing, but also to have solutions. So it's not going to cover the whole range of issues and challenges that we all in this field are working on sign language testing have experienced, but I will try to give you an overview of some selected examples. As you might know, sign language test research is a fairly young, let's call it a subdiscipline of general language testing research and sign linguistics. I would like to set the scene first in the Swiss context. So, as you might know, we have 3 national sign languages in Switzerland. One is in the German-speaking part is Swiss German Sign Language, or DSGS, with approximately 5,500 deaf sign language users. In the French-speaking part, approximately 1,700 deaf users of langue des signes français, French sign language, and approximately 300 deaf sign language users of Italian sign language. First of all, I would like to address the question like, where does learning of DSGS, so DSGS, Swiss German Sign Language, takes place? We have different course providers here in German-speaking part of Switzerland. By far the largest is the Swiss Deaf Association, but there are also private companies providing courses, both to adult learners, be they hearing, they might do it because for professional purposes, because they maybe experience a hearing loss in adulthood, different motivations, or parents who have a deaf child, hearing parents who have a deaf child learning Swiss German Sign Language. We also have in our university, for short as HFH, we have a sign language interpreter training program. So that's also where learning of DSGS takes place, or schools for the deaf. So these are just examples, right? So, and where does assessment take place? Well, basically it's the same where the learning takes place. For example, at institutional level, we have final exams. In Swiss German Sign Language, we have both formative and summative assessment during the course of a semester, by the end of the semester, by the end of the program, after 3 years. Or you might have an end of course exam when you take a tertiary education, continuous education course in Swiss German Sign Language. We do not have yet, at least, a certification system here in Switzerland, which means basically, for example, if you apply for a job, be it in a school, be it at a university, that you need, for example, fulfill certain language requirements according to the CF levels of the Common European Framework of Reference. But this is something in the future that will come. Just a short side note, DSGS and the CFR, it's a very big issue in Switzerland, generally speaking. There's an ongoing implementation led by the Swiss Deaf Federation and other stakeholders like our university. And the ongoing implementation also has been supported through European projects like ProSign, which is a project at the European Center for Modern Languages in Graz with colleagues in Berlin, Ireland, in Dublin, and the Netherlands and Switzerland. In German Switzerland, we do have research. There has been done research on Swiss German Sign Language for the last 30 plus years. That sounds like a lot, but if you compare it, for example, what we know about languages like English, German, it's not a lot. We don't have fully described
Okay, I think we seem to have lost Tobias. I think he's coming back. Tobias.
Did I?
We missed, I think we missed maybe 1 minute of
Okay, so
something happened there.
Sorry.
Could you please share your screen again?
Sure.
That's great. Thank you.
Sure. Sorry. So we were there, right? So
yes.
Okay. Sorry. Okay. Continuing now. Okay. So basically, there has been done a lot of research, or there has been done research on Swiss German Sign Language, on the structure, on the use, but it's not as, and this applies to many sign languages worldwide. It's not fully described. It's not fully documented. We don't know at all. We don't know anything, or just a little bit, about the acquisition of Swiss German Sign Language, both as L1 in children, acquiring DSGS as a first language, and we do not know anything about how adult learners, the different developmental milestones, what a difficulty learning Swiss German Sign Language. So this, as you might imagine, this is really an issue on if you want to use research to inform test development. If you want to develop tests that that are based on empirical language data. The other big issue are language resources. For example, to have corpora. Corpora could be used, for example, depending on the purpose, if you use to, for example, to generate frequency lists of which exist, for example, for spoken English or for English frequency list of vocabulary to inform vocabulary testing. That's the good news. We just applied for funding to set up a learner corpus. So we hope that we can look into that matter when funding is granted. We don't know yet. The other thing about language resources are lexicon. So there's one online lexicon available, which is maintained by the Swiss Deaf Federation, which has been developed over many years through different research projects in the past. It's been updated continuously, but it couldn't be used really for research purposes. This is really targeting the learners, which is a very important and good resource. And the other thing is there is no reference grammar that describes the language fully in order to take it out of your bookshelf, so to say, and see, depending on the purpose of your test, to use it as a reference. So in the next step, I would like to look at, I'm going through different examples that are based on projects that we have been conducting in the past and that are also currently ongoing. One is, that's a 3-year project funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation. It's called SMILE. You see the full title here, which is pretty long and complicated. So just SMILE, that's a sign for it, SMILE, SMILE. It's a collaborative project with research partners at the EALTA Research Institute here in Switzerland, our university, and University of Surrey in the UK. So in the overall goal, just to set the frame, the overall goal is the development of an automatic sign language recognition system to assess vocabulary knowledge in Swiss German Sign Language learners. So basically, it's the learner sits in front of a camera, signing lexical items, something like house, car, very basic, but really very basic items. The system is recognizing the sign and providing feedback. So that's the basic scenario. It's much more complicated than that. I'm not going to talk very much about the technology behind it. It's just being used as different kind of, or we had different strands of research that were clustered around this overall goal of the project. Based on this SMILE project, we developed, we sampled vocabulary items. We do have teaching materials that have been developed in the early 2000s here in German Switzerland, which are described or which are used for 4 different courses. Each course is about 30 lessons of contact hours. So it's a total of about 120 hours contact hours for sign language classes. And the materials around it, so it's in total, it's about 3,800 signs. This data bank it's a different issue. We're currently working on that. But the interesting thing is like, how do you sample items, right? What we did for this project, because the focus was really on the technology side, was really to sample about 100 items so that the system can be trained by different signs that have different manual components that are very different in terms of complexity of the used hand shapes, of the movements, in order to train the system. There were different linguistic criteria to how we came from approximately 4,000 to this 100 items, which I'm not going into detail here because it will take too much time. But we ended up with 100 items. And what you might based on this, what we did there, we came up with the idea, what do we do when we want to continuously assess the vocabulary knowledge of our students in a simple vocabulary size test? So we need to have a pool of items that can be exchanged over the course of the next years, and which should describe different, or should that in theory are used at different levels of the CFR. So based on that, we actually, based on that, we tried to we started a study aligning selected signs from this 3,800, we selected 600, to align them to the CFR. So we had, methodology-wise, we oriented ourselves, or we got support from existing studies for CFR alignment studies for spoken languages. And what we did is basically asking, we used the overall production scale from the CFR. So, and the raters, we had 11 raters who saw a lexical sign, and they should respond to the question, what does an adult learner need to know in order to be able to produce the sign? And with no, we refer to just those described can-do descriptors of the CFR. But already during the process of actually planning the study, about conducting it, we realized it's more about investigating the methodology. So I'm expecting not too much in terms of that we have a fixed pool of signs that are aligned to CFR levels, because there, during this process, we got a lot of feedback from the raters. And right now, really, it's those days we are doing a rash analysis, a statistical analysis of the data. I'm very excited to see how this comes out. And we also plan to have a focus group with all those raters in about a month. So I can tell you more about that at some point, later. So why am I talking about this? It's about challenge, just showing one challenge if you just starting with sampling items for a very simple vocabulary size test. So a vocabulary size test basically just tests how many words or signs does a learner know at a certain level of his or her development. Okay, so I talked about possibilities to sample items. I talked about the challenges. I talk now about different vocabulary size test methodologies, which are very common in when you look into language testing research for spoken languages. And when I talk about spoken languages, I don't mean necessarily speaking, I just mean spoken language versus sign languages. So just to keep these terms clear. So one of the methodologies are so-called YesNo tests. A YesNo test, I will show you an example just in a second. On the next slide, it's basically a learner sees a sign on video and he or she needs to confirm if he or she knows the sign or not. It's a methodology that's been discussed, very controversial in the literature. We selected this method just as a kind of proof of concept because it's never been used in sign language testing at all. The second one is an L1, L2 translation test. So adult learners see a written word on a PowerPoint in this case, and they are asked to produce the sign. What you see here is the German word Straße, which means street. And there is a sentence below it to disambiguate the meaning. So they are not asked to translate the sentence, they're just asked to translate the word street to produce the sign for street. This is a video recording, I will show you, start in a moment. I will tell you what you will see, and then I play it for a few seconds. And so basically what you see here, it's an online format where you have an instruction telling people what they are supposed to be doing, how long the entire testing takes time. They are asked here to watch those, it's about 100 items. And it should indicate if they know the signs or not. So here I type in my name as a test taker. Okay. So this is just to give you a short overview on how this test format looks like. In the next step, what you see here is a schematic representation for a sign language recognition system. This is very simplified for the purpose of showing how it works. So basically what an automatic recognition system needs to do is it needs to recognize the form of a sign. It needs to compare it with a reference, meaning it needs to know why house, for example, house the sign this way in a basic form, if you can call it this way. But how does the system know if you produce house more on the right side or on the left side, if it's still right or if it's wrong? So the system needs to be trained what the reference is. And at the end, it should provide feedback to the learner. So this reference, so why did I show you this? It's actually interesting because it really triggered a lot of questions in our research team and a lot of research what we did, because we were thinking about not only for the automatic recognition system, which should be applied, which is applied to testing, but also we need to know first, like, what is, call it this way, what is a correctly produced sign? It sounds like a very simple question, but it isn't. So because we discussed, or my colleagues discussed a lot, like what is, not only what is the reference for human raters. See, you get data from test takers, vocabulary items, and the raters are asked to analyze it, to rate it on a scoring level of right or wrong. Even there, we had a lot of discussions. So how is the criteria of correctness defined? So how do we know where are variants which we would say, this is okay, this is totally acceptable, depending on the context maybe, but where is it where you would need to say, no, this is not correct. This needs to be, if you translate it into testing scenario, where do you need to say, no, this is wrong, there's no score assigned to this. So this is just to give you an overview. It's on a very simple level. We are not on a sentence level, we are not on a discourse level or interaction. It's really just about this small piece of scoring, basically, which triggered a lot of research. So what we did basically is, or what we didn't find in the literature, there hasn't been done a lot of research on variants, and it's basically one of the core questions we try to address is on what are variants that are acceptable. So what we did is, led by the overall question, I put in parentheses, what is a correctly produced sign, because There's still a lot of discussion going on if there is something like a base form or a citation form in sign languages or not. We don't know. But what we did is we collected data from 20 L1 deaf L1 users of DSGS and 20 L2 users, adult users of who learned it as an adult. And we had a team of 2 deaf sign language teachers who were trained as linguists and hearing linguists who analyzed the data and who had a lot of discussions. And they basically came up in the first step with 6 different categories, clustering or classifying different variants, which were then translated for testing purposes into something like this is right and this is wrong. So this was a really, really important piece of research to approach defining the criterion of reference, even if it looks in a scoring sheet very simple, saying something is right or something is wrong. But this is a very important piece of research that has been done to approach this issue. In the next step, we looked into iterator. Well, it sounds a little bit funny to look into iterator disagreement, but it's actually very interesting to look into that. So what we did is it's the same test. It's this translation test. We collected data from 20 adult learners of DSGS. And all the recordings of those 100 items were rated independently by 2 raters, 2 judges. And then they had to rate it on the right-wrong level. And then we did a rush analysis to see where there was disagreement between those 2 raters. There were 3 items, I think. And then we did a follow-up interview, which was actually, that's an interesting piece of research. All is interesting, but this was particularly interesting. So it's basically links to the slide before. It really asks like how strictly those raters interpreted the criterion of correctness. And it triggered really a lot of thinking, a lot of discussion, which is still going on in our team, which is very important. But this is really I know there has been quite a few of publications on rater behavior for written testing on written German or other languages, but this is really the very first step to actually to not only to research it, but also to trigger a more general discussion, which is very important, I think, to move the field forward. As you might know, one of the issues is really on if you develop a new test, you might lack other tests that test a similar construct or even the same construct to investigate validity or to assess criterion-related validity. So what are possibilities? These are just possibilities to overcome this lack. So one possible approach is that's what has been done by colleagues and by ourselves here in Switzerland is to use variables that could explain test performances of test takers. In this case, testing children. So what we did is set for example, a chronological age or the age of access to a sign language in relation to test performance in order to see how strongly they can explain differences in test performances, just to approach validity. So those are just, small steps. And one very important issue is really, especially in small countries or small European countries, we have more than one sign language, you don't have sample sizes like for studies on English testing, where you might have hundreds or thousands of test takers. So we are talking about also, this is also a challenge in itself. So, and when you test adults, possible variables that could contribute to or try to explain test differences in the test performance is the number of attended courses, self-assessment of their own sign language competence, or in which context they are learning a sign language or are using a sign language. Meaning, for example, someone who works at the Swiss Deaf Federation will have a lot of interaction and possibilities to learn the language, whereas someone just taking a course 2 hours a week, going home, no access to the language in other contexts, it will take longer. Another issue, how to address validity or how to approach validity is to establish validity evidence, was in a different project on a sentence repetition test we developed a few years ago, targeting deaf children and adolescents. We have in total, I'm not sure if you know about the method of sentence repetition test. Basically, test takers see a sentence or see sentences of different length and complexity and are asked to repeat them, and then are scored according to different criteria. So we basically developed this test based on sentence repetition tests of other sign languages. We were very lucky. We got quite a large sample for our context, 46 learners, which I think is quite good. Between 6 and 16 years old, we developed a scoring instrument, and we were thinking about how can we approach validity of this instrument, of this test. So what we did, we compared. We had 14 deaf adults of deaf adults using Swiss German Sign Language, assuming that in theory they should outperform the children, right? So we made a comparison between the adult data and the children data, and overall adults outperformed the children overall, not on every item. And then we were also lucky that we had a narrative comprehension test that has been developed in a different project. And we had a small subsample of those 46 children that were also tested at the narrative comprehension test to see if there's it was just a correlation. I know that's not the strongest evidence, but at least I think it gives you at least some idea, and there was a strong correlation. It's not the same construct, but there were some overlapping subcomponents, let's call it subcomponents, that were tested in both tests. So this is just to give you some ideas how validity evidence can be gathered, can be collected. Another thing, or another possibility is that has been done in a test for German Sign Language. So there was a receptive skills test testing development of morphology and syntactic structures in children 3 to 11 years old. The test has been adapted from British to German Sign Language. So what we did is not just doing a translation. We looked into the literature. The goal was really to see, do those linguistic structures actually, based on the research that's available, actually, do they exist in both languages? So we had certain, call it linguistic categories that did not exist, or we don't know if they are the same in German Sign Language or not. And there were linguistic categories that are comparable, but are realized in a different way. So this is also one approach to look into the literature to see, to make sure in terms of the content, so this is more about content validity here, to see if this is if structures are comparable, not only assuming there's this one sign language and there's another one and just take everything for granted that we have the same linguistic structures, right? So yeah, with that, I'm coming to a close. So I have tried to address some challenges that come up during when you develop sign language test. I've addressed a few challenges related to vocabulary testing. Some of the challenges are rooted or are caused by lack of research, by the lack of available language resources. I have shown to illustrate a few examples how those challenges can be solved or can be overcome to establish overall validity of a test and scoring instruments. For example, this one study I've mentioned where we investigated what are acceptable variants of a lexical sign. And with lexical sign, sorry, I should have said that before, it's something like house, car, yeah. So I hope that this gave them insight into issues in our Swiss-German context, on test development, on research, on issues how this could be solved. And I also would like to address some future issues for the future or future development. I mean, what we really should do more in the future is to validate sign language tests and more recent models of test validation like social cognitive approaches or more argument-based approaches. I think language assessment literacy is a very big issue, meaning what should different stakeholders that are involved in language testing, raters, the learners, institutions, what do they need to know about language testing? A rater needs to know more about it than a learner, obviously. And a really big issue we have here right now is rater training, which we address in the future. And I think there's a lot what we should do. We should more closely collaborate with spoken language testing. I think we have a few links here and there that we should strengthen in the future. And I think a very important issue is people who work in sign language assessment work with members of your local deaf community to involve the deaf community. And I really would like to thank all deaf and hearing colleagues that have been involved both here in Switzerland, but also in other countries or contributed to those projects I talked about. Yeah, I would like to thank. Yeah, that's it. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Tobias. That was great.
Sure.
We have a few questions. If anybody has any questions, please put them in to the Q&A section. I'm just going to choose a few of the ones we've had. Some very interesting questions here. Okay, one from Beppy, and who asks, how do you deal with the mouthings which are connected to the written or spoken German word?
In this concrete example, or, well, you don't know.
In general.
In general, for the, I think I referred to this vocabulary yes/no test. For the yes/no test, we run into a problem. That's a very good question, Beppy. Actually, we run into a problem because we ask people in the yes/no test to try to not to differentiate between the manual part, meaning what you do with your hands, with your body, and with what you do with your mouth, like saying house without a voice, without your voice. And the problem really was that people, we had also nonsense signs as distractors, so to say, in the test, that people focused on the mouthing when they didn't know the sign. So that's kind of like threatens the validity of the test. So we couldn't really solve that. We had some possibility. We have been thinking about how to solve that, but haven't really found a solution yet. For the translation test, where the test takers are asked to produce something, we did in this this study we did not. We only focused at the manual part.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you. Okay, I have another question from Lorena, who just asks, do deaf children in Switzerland study sign language at school as their main language? And how do they study for?
In the schools, yes.
Yeah.
There are developments in the schools for the deaf in German Switzerland using a bilingual approach, so using both languages. But I'm not, I have contacts to the schools, but I'm not professionally linked to the schools. I'm not involved into teacher training, so I don't know all the details.
Okay.
But there are definitely developments working on bilingual approaches to use both language equally.
Okay, thank you. I have a question from Gladys. I ask one of her questions is, do you think there's anything from classic language testing theory that you think does not apply to sign language testing?
Yes, that's a very good question. I have to admit that I don't, from a theoretical point of view, I know both classical test theory and item response theory, or what is based for when you apply Reich models. I'm not too much of an expert, to be honest. So, but what I can tell you about feedback from colleagues from spoken language testing is that a lot of studies that has been published frame language testing within classical test theory. And this has been criticized, which I totally understand. And I think we should definitely move more into using more modern testing theories.
Okay, good. Okay, Gladys has another question. I'll just ask that. When she says, in Brazil, we have Libras, which is the name of the Brazilian sign language, which is compulsory in schools. In the university where Gladys works, she says we have a Libras teacher education course. And they think it's time to start thinking about a proficiency exam for this. So do you have any advice or any recommendations for reading that she could do?
I think you should definitely contact Beppy, who is also on this webinar, because they did a lot of test development for assessing functional skills in their students in Utrecht. So maybe they can hook up. And there's I think there are a few publications from Beppy and colleagues out there. You can send me an email and I can forward it to Beppy. There are some actually, and the interesting part is there is so little research on assessment for adult learners how to assess proficiency in adult learners. There are just very few publications available. And if you send me an email, I can send you those few references that I have. Yes.
Okay. I have a question from John, who says, what are some solutions to managing rater bias regarding dialects?
Wow. Honestly, we haven't addressed that issue yet. We are, I would say, starting, well, the other way, like you, in terms of dialect variants, or?
He says both regional and social dialects.
I have to admit, we haven't addressed that issue here yet. Not yet, but it's definitely of importance. So I can't really respond to that, John. What we tried in terms of regional variation, and this is just where you can control it, like in vocabulary testing, you can try to avoid regional variance, which we try to do. to avoid that, but which you can't do when you do something comparable to an oral proficiency interview, obviously. Yeah.
Okay. Let me find another one. Okay, an anonymous question here. Okay, so somebody here who's interested in the Swiss example especially, and is quite interested and surprised to hear of the different sign languages in Swiss that seem to overlap with the geography of the three languages spoken in Switzerland.
Exactly.
So can you tell us a little bit more about this?
It's basically, we have three main language regions. It's the Italian-speaking part, the Ticino, the French-speaking part, the Romand, western part of Switzerland, and the German-speaking part. And there is Retro-Romanic, which is spoken in different areas. So, but just talking about those three main language regions, we have Swiss German Sign Language, as I said. It's different from German Sign Language. It's not something like, it's not standardized as many sign languages, I would assume. There is no research yet to say what is the difference between Swiss German and High German Sign Language. It's not comparable to, maybe they are as similar or as different as High German, used as a standard variant in Germany, and Swiss German dialects, which is a totally different discussion coming into. And the version French sign language used in the French-speaking part seems to be a little bit closer to the French-speaking or to French sign language used in France, but also there are regional variants, so I can't really say how close or different they are. You do understand each other as we do here in German, Switzerland, with deaf people from Germany. And the Italian version, I would assume it's maybe closer linked to Italian sign language used in northern Italy, like Milano, which isn't that far away, because there are always a lot of connections and interaction between deaf communities in the Ticino and Milano maybe, or other areas. Is this sufficient?
That sounds good. I was just saying, do you think that this, this is my question, so do you think that this, does this make the Swiss situation a special case, do you think, compared with other regions in the world?
Well, a special case, not, well, in Belgium, you also have two spoken languages and you have two different sign languages. So it's not unique. I think what's unique is that there are three different sign languages in one country. It's a small country. But I mean, the issues are the same for other small linguistic communities. I mean, the same issues that you have in terms of when you do research, in terms of maybe the pressure on the language, in terms of when you want to have, for example, if you do rash analysis, a specific statistical analysis way of analyzing data, I read once you need at least 100 test takers. This is something in our context, which is, it's very hard to get that compared to, for example, John Hanna, who's on this webinar as well. I mean, they have data from, I don't know how many hundred or even 1,000 kids, which is a totally different issue, right? So what you can do, so that makes it unique, but also difficult or challenging.
Okay, thank you. Okay, if anybody has any other questions, please send them in, because we just have a few minutes left. I'll just go through one or two more. Lorena asks again about your project. She says, are your project outcomes meant to be linked to producing CFR tests on spoken languages for deaf people?
No, we are using several, or the goal is to have different tests available that are in sign language, testing sign language competencies of different users of a sign language linked to a CFR, that's for sure.
Okay. John has another question. He has several questions actually, but I'll just choose the last one. He says, going forward, how do you see computer-based assessments integrating into dynamic assessment philosophies?
I think there are two issues you are combining here, John, which is very important. I think first of all, computer-based testing or all those technologies like automatic sign and recognition shouldn't be only used for assessment, also can use for learning purposes. So it's basically, there's a lot of potential in it, but based on the structure of sign languages, based on the modality, it makes it more difficult to use, for example, automatic recognition systems above their lexical level. And then even combining with learning and dynamic assessment approaches makes it, I guess, even more difficult. But I think that's definitely worth investigating. And actually, I'm planning to get funding to have a workshop on sign language assessment on productive skills, hopefully next year. So this is maybe also one of the issues that could be addressed within this workshop. So hope to have you here, John.
Okay, I'll ask one last question, and that's John had one other question. He says here in the United States, we have challenges with algorithms that don't recognize video from people of color. So there's a computational bias here. So
that's interesting. Okay.
have you experienced anything like this?
No idea. No idea. Can't respond to that. Sorry.
Okay.
But what I could imagine, I mean, it's a totally different scenario, but it goes into a similar direction if you look at automatic speech recognition system. For example, if you think about automatic subtitling from YouTube videos, this is based, or I guess it's kind of like normed on average male voice, white male voice, I guess. So that's a similar issue or computational bias you are addressing, but I can't really, this is not really my area of expertise. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think we're having this problem with bias of algorithms in lots of ways, in spoken language testing as well.
Okay.
Okay, I think that's most of the questions that we've had there. I apologize if I've missed anybody. So it just falls on me to thank everybody again for their participation today. Thank you especially to Tobias and to Elsa for their participation in today's webinar. If you have any feedback about today's session, please send me an email. I will make sure that Tobias gets any feedback that you send. We'll be having more webinars in the summer with different topics, I'm sure. If you have any suggestions that you have, please send me an email as well. The recording of this webinar should be up on the EALTA website for anyone to access. We've had a few issues with getting things uploaded recently, but I'll make sure that this gets up quite soon. So thank you again. Thanks to everyone. We'll sign off now. Thanks for joining us today, and we hope to see you again sometime soon.
Thanks a lot. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.